Shout out to bring our Q, Julius, you legend. We're going to do a joint interview, yeah? Yeah, we'll do a joint interview, Julius. Thanks for the support. You're a legend. From your girls, Raven and Ellie.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Edgar Berlanga's trainer believes his boxer can eventually win a title at cruiserweight. Having not yet won a title at super middleweight, it seems strange that they should set their sights on a title 2 divisions and several pounds north of super middleweight, where Edgar campaigns. Edgar Berlanga roared loudly following the first 16 fights of his career. While the violent stoppage victories placed the super middleweight contender on the map, Juan de Leon, Berlanga's new trainer, becomes agitated when his fighter's knockout power begins to steal all of the headlines. More than anything, although de Leon knows good and well that Berlanga, 20-0 with 16 KOs, is a deadly puncher, after spending the past few months working closely with him, he's convinced that his brain is just as impressive as his brawn. The one thing that he has that nobody can take away from him is the power, de Leon said during an interview with FightHype.com. Another thing is, he's a smart kid. He showed me that.
I think De Leon needs to hold his horses when it comes to Edgar's power.
We don't actually know that Edgar has world-class power because in his last outing, he was in there with a very aggressive customer, a come-forward guy in his late 30s that goes by the name Romer Angulo. Kind of guy that's going to give you plenty of opportunities to land hard shots, land hard punches. And Edgar couldn't take him out. In fact, I don't know what Edgar did in that fight to win a points decision. I really don't. It seems to me like he spent most of that fight circling away from Romer Angulo, and
he seemed squirrely. He didn't want to punch with him.
I believe if they take Edgar nice and easy for the next 2 to 3 to 4 fights, I think he can become a world champion. I think he can become a champion at 168, 75, and cruiserweight because he has the height. Before Berlanga attempts to prove De Leon right, the highly ranked super middleweight contender has work to do in his current weight class. Currently, with the heavy-hitting young star ranked in the top 4 in both IBF and WBO sanctioning bodies, he finds himself on the edge of his first crack at a world title. But despite his rapid rise up the super middleweight charts, De Leon is hoping that Berlanga...
Yeah, this guy's not ready for Canelo. I don't care what his trainer's hoping for. There's only one champion at super middleweight.
And I can only tell you what I think. And if you want to know what I think, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do, not only is Edgar not ready for Canelo, he's not ready for David Morrell, he's not ready for David Benavidez, he's not ready for Caleb Plant.
He's not ready.
De Leon is hoping that Berlanga's handlers will take their time with him.
They better if they know what's good for him. He's not ready for some of these guys.
Pure boxers like Lerone Richards and Anthony Sims. Punchers like Carlos Gongora.
Christian Mabili.
I don't think Edgar's ready for any of those guys. And those guys just so happen to be up-and-comers the same way that he's an up-and-comer. Some unbeaten, some not, though all the same. I don't think Edgar's ready for any of those guys, let alone the upper echelon super middleweights.
They've been trying to develop Edgar as a fighter, and it's noticeable. They put him in there with 2 moving targets, 2 of them. Caceres and Steve Rolls.
He got dropped by Caceres, and he looked limited with Steve Rolls. In fact, he looked like shit.
He looked awful.
And I'm not just being hard on the guy for the sake of being hard on the guy. I have to be honest. Marcellus Caceres is a fighter who was stopped by Billy Joe Saunders, of all people. Billy Joe Saunders is a pure boxer. He's not even a knockout merchant. But when push came to shove, Billy knocked that guy out. Now that same Marcellus Caceres went the distance with what's supposed to be a world-class puncher in Edgar Berlanga. And
he could knock Caceres out, and Caceres ended up knocking him down.
He knocked down Edgar Berlanga, what's supposed to be a world-class puncher. But his world-class punch, world-class power, I guess it wasn't there in the Caceres fight. Wasn't there in the Steve Rolls fight either. Steve Rolls, who was knocked out at middleweight by Gennady Golovkin.
He was at middleweight. Up there at super middleweight when he fought Edgar, he went the distance. Made Edgar look bad.
So the matchmakers must have been telling themselves, these moving targets we're putting Edgar in there with, they're flustering him, they're troubling him. Let's give him a more stationary target. Let's give him a guy that instead of moving away from Edgar,
he'll come towards him. He'll bring the fight to Edgar. So it's easier for Edgar to get off big punches and big shots. They do that, they get him Romer Angulo.
Seasoned guy, experienced guy, hefty knockout percentage, but for the most part, a flat-footed fighter. Flat-footed fighter who's at his best when he's coming forward. And instead of Edgar getting back to his knockout merchant ways, he ends up moving away from Romer and Gulo. He doesn't score the knockout.
The most memorable thing Edgar did in that whole fight was bite the guy on the neck.
Bit the fucking guy. They had to send him to the hospital, give him anti-venom to prevent him from turning into a Puerto Rican. Edgar didn't land any meaningful punches, eye-catching shots in that fight with Romer and Gulo. And this is a guy who was the opposite of what he faced in Caceres and Steve Rolls. He wasn't a moving target. He was a more stationary target that would stand right in front of him and let the fists fly. A guy more or less who should have been, tailor-made for Edgar Berlanga to get off big shots, big punches. He didn't do that. Edgar's development is stifled.
It's arrested. His development is arrested development.
I said it before and I'm saying it here again. They made way too much of that knockout streak he was on in his first 16 fights. And when you're racking up knockouts that early in a fight and that early in your career, you're not banking rounds. You're not getting rounds in the bank where you're supposed to be working on things like your jab and your combinations, your feints, your movement.
Working on your own and reading the other guys.
Judging distance. These little things that go on through the course of a match to where you might land a hard punch and a guy don't fall down right away. I'm not judging Edgar harshly for this, you understand. In his first 16 fights, he went out there and he did what he was supposed to do. But this is a byproduct of that. You got all those knockouts so early in a fight and so early in your career, and too much was made of that.
He got a lot of attention for that stuff, but I don't think he was fully developed as a fighter then, and I don't think he's fully developed now.
It just is what it is. That's where we are with all of this. The level of attention that he got as a result of that knockout streak.
He's under a magnifying glass now. He's under a microscope, developing before the Gentiles' eyes.
The boxing community at large, and you know how people are. They're harsh. They're harsh critics. So, he's got pressure.
I don't like how this kid reacts when he gets hit. And that's because, well, he's not used to it.
He's used to his going in there, hitting a guy hard, guy falls down. That's what he's become accustomed to.
And that's not going to happen every time you get out there.
His trainer, De Leon, says, I believe the next 2, 3, 4 fights with Edgar, and if he applies what I'm telling him, I think he'll be ready to fight for the championship. But nice and easy, no rush. And you have to wonder, does Top Rank and their matchmakers, do they agree with that? Do they want to nurse this kid for 3 or 4 more fights?
20-0 with 16 knockouts. Do they want to keep coddling him?
Guy gets hit with a simple jab, he stops dead in his tracks.
Looks like a deer in the headlights. Guy who's being put in developmental fights, and he's not developing.
They're gonna put up with that for 3 or 4 more fights? I don't know, we'll see. And just in keeping with the theme of all things super middleweight, Gennady Golovkin, on judges for the first 2 Canelo fights, they were used like disposable tissues. We know that the 3rd installment is en route this upcoming weekend on DAZN pay-per-view now that they have pay-per-view functionality.
A lot of people aren't happy about that.
But I said it before and I'll say it again here and now. Let's say that Canelo Alvarez would have taken the Showtime deal as opposed to the DAZN deal. These same people griping about pay-per-views would still have to pay per view, because if he were on Showtime, that's what they would do.
They bill his fights as pay-per-views the same as DAZN is billing his fight as a pay-per-view.
There's no getting out of it at this point, and that has everything to do with Canelo Alvarez's celebrity. At least DAZN ain't trying to sell you Charles Martin versus Luis Ortiz on pay-per-view, or Luis Ortiz versus Andy Ruiz on pay-per-view.
Thurman versus Barrios on pay-per-view.
Whether you like it or not, Canelo vs. Golovkin 3 is still a mega match on a bigger scale, a much bigger scale than any of those fights. And this fight is more box office than any of those fights. This 3rd installment with Gennady Golovkin, who indicated that he has become much more blasé about those negative experiences, the scoring from the first 2 fights. Even if he still feels he was sufficiently robbed, the Kazakh puncher compared the judges in those fights to disposable tissue, implying that what he feels was those judges' poor judgment will not necessarily be replicated in his upcoming trilogy bout with Alvarez. I'll be honest with you, I moved on the next day, Golovkin said. I haven't thought about it much. I realized that those people who gave those scores, they were used. They were used like disposable tissues are being used. It was time to use them. They were used and disposed of.
I didn't agree with the scoring in the first fight. I scored the first fight for Gennady Golovkin.
I was up in arms about the scoring in that fight here on this channel. But the second fight, I wasn't up in arms about the scores for the second fight because I felt like there was a credible enough argument there that you could have scored it for Canelo, that the second fight was closer than the first.
In my mind's eye, they're 1-1 with each other. Golovkin won the first fight, Canelo won the second.
And this will be the tiebreaker for my money. This is a far more competitive trilogy than the trilogy we just saw between Deontay and Tyson Fury. The last two fights basically consisted of Tyson Fury battering Wilder, beating him from pillar to post.
Up and down the ring, that's all that was. This was more competitive than that, but you're mad at this?
Oh, I know, because Golovkin's old. And what was Luis Ortiz when Wilder fought him for the second time after having already knocked him out?
On pay-per-view.
And what was he when Andy Ruiz more recently took him on?
On pay-per-view.
But Golovkin's old, I know. The build-up to the third Alvarez versus Golovkin fight has been marked by Alvarez's unusually aggressive attitude. Golovkin brushed off the Mexican superstar's rhetoric and intense stare-downs as evidence that there is toxic energy in his camp. I cannot speak for him, his behavior. I think he just shows his true face. Golovkin said, the way he was probably brought up and the level of toxicity around him, toxic people that are in his camp.
Yeah, I mean, Canelo has been uncharacteristically aggressive with Gennady, but I also think Gennady's being somewhat disingenuous. These two have history.
You can't pretend to be Switzerland when you've already fought this guy 2 times, and not only have you called him a pet cheat, you also claim he robbed you. So, I mean, at least we know that some part of you don't like this guy.
I'm not telling you that Gennady's wrong for thinking what he's thinking or saying what he's saying. I'm just saying he's pretending to be Switzerland. He's pretending to be impartial.
When the truth is, that guy don't like you, and you don't like him, and the real difference between you is he's showing it, and you're not.
He wants to be diplomatic? Let him be diplomatic. We know you don't like Canelo.
Saying things like Canelo's biggest weakness is arrogance, and arrogance is punishable.
Golovkin hasn't been a hothead in the build-up. He's kept a steely reserve.
Talking about the scoring in the first fight, Gennady said he doesn't believe that infraction should be swept under the rug. I don't think this can ever be forgotten, says Golovkin to the New York Daily News. Some people came to terms with the situation. Some people don't want to continue thinking about it. Some are turning their eyes away from it. They fought to a controversial 12-round split draw in 2017, and Canelo won a very close majority decision in their rematch.
If you're telling me that you think Canelo got a gift draw in that first fight?
I agree with you. I scored the first fight for Gennady Golovkin, but if you don't see me harping on and on about it, it's because Gennady got a second chance to right that wrong. He chose to fight that guy for a second time. In spite of the gift draw and the clenbuterol fiasco, he chose to go back in there with that guy, put a stamp on it, and he came up short. He didn't do that.
Am I supposed to still shake my fists at the sky 5 years later?
It's done. There's nothing anybody can do about it. Canelo Alvarez ain't the first guy that's been accused of getting a gift draw. Some people think Wilder got a gift draw in the first Fury fight. Some people think Oscar De La Hoya got a gift in the Felix Sturm fight. Some people think Floyd Mayweather got a gift in the Castillo fight, the first one.
Am I supposed to still be shaking my fists at the sky all these years later? It happens.
Canelo doesn't bother me at all, but when a person has a lot of bad traits that get in the way of him living a normal life, say Golovkin, that bothers him. That's what we see right now. Canelo is coming off his first defeat since 2013 as he dropped a 12-round decision to WBA light heavyweight champion Dmitry Bivol. In his last fight, the knockout was not necessary to beat him, Golovkin said. It's encouraging that the judges are not loyal to Canelo anymore. They don't feel this burden of his image. Golovkin believes that he's figured out Canelo's biggest weakness as a fighter. Arrogance, Golovkin said, and arrogance is punishable.
So how do you punish arrogance in a boxing match?
When Gennady Golovkin says that Canelo Alvarez's arrogance is punishable, does he exhibit that arrogance in the squared circle? And if so, how? And how does Golovkin mean to punish him for it? That's what we're going to find out next Saturday.
See if they haven't taught that old dog some new tricks.
That old dog that says Canelo saying he lost a couple rounds to Bivol shows he's lost touch with reality. It would not be appropriate for me to suggest what the score might be, Golovkin told BoxingScene.com through a translator. I'm not a judge. People probably question my opinion of that anyway, so I don't want to do that. But Bivol looked better, and his win was more convincing than the score reflects. The behavior of his opponent, Canelo, raising his arms after the fight, and later saying that he probably lost only a couple of rounds, that just shows he's lost touch with reality and his failure to assess things adequately.
I think Gennady Golovkin's having a lot of fun with that.
He relishes the opportunity to chime in on that loss, Canelo's latest loss, more than he might let on, more than he cares to admit, he's enjoying himself. Bivol performance against Alvarez was more convincing than any Alvarez or Golovkin accomplished in their first two fights. Golovkin feels Russia's Bivol could have been even more dominant that night. I wouldn't say that I was surprised because I know who Canelo is, I know who Bivol is. Bivol said, "What surprised me more was the reaction of people who were under some illusion that basically have been kidding themselves for a long time about Alvarez. I think Bivol could have been more superior. We all saw how he looked after the fight. He didn't even look tired. He had the ability to make his win even more convincing."
You're about to get the third opportunity to make a win convincing against that same guy.
That same Canelo Alvarez that Dmitry Bivol quite convincingly decisioned in Canelo's last fight.
These strolls down memory lane, these trips we've been taking aside, that's the task in front of Gennady, regardless of how he feels about the first fight, the second fight, or the Bivol fight.
Canelo's aggressiveness, his arrogance, or the lack thereof, regardless of any of that stuff, that's what he's got to do on Saturday.
Beat him convincingly.
Can he do it? Well, that's what we pay to see. That's what we pay to find out. There is a question as to whether or not this fight is even buzzing.
The build-up and the excitement, the enthusiasm is not akin to what we saw with the first two fights.
I didn't expect it to be. I don't expect the energy, the enthusiasm, or even the turnout to be exactly the same as what it was for the first two fights. But what I do expect is that even with that, it will still be bigger than anything else going on for the remainder of this year here stateside.
Because what the hell are we going to compare it to?
What do Matchroom and DAZN's competitors have going on here stateside for the remainder of this year that is on the same scale as this fight? What? The fight between Terrence and Errol that isn't done yet?
The fight that's rumored to be going down in November, late November, that hasn't been announced.
While we're in September, well into September, headed towards the middle.
The fight that Tim Smith, at the beginning of this year, said people wouldn't buy. They'd choose to steal it. We talking about that fight? That fight is supposed to be bigger than this fight. Well, they have to announce it first.
I didn't forget what the PBC's VP of Communications said at the beginning of this year. He said that fight ain't box office. People are going to steal it. He doesn't sound too confident that fight would do well at the box office, and that's what he kicked off this year saying. The PBC's VP of Communications.
I think Wilder's ring return could do okay at the gate and okay at the box office.
Problem with that is, there's a card happening that same day around that same time. The rematch between Devin Haney and George Kambosos.
Not saying anybody's excited about the rematch between Devin and George, but that's certainly going to cut into Wilder versus Helenius's buy rate.
Between pirate streams that people use to watch fights for free and a show happening on the biggest sports network in the country at the same time as that pay-per-view, that could very well affect what it does at the box office.
So tell me, what do either Top Rank or the PBC have going on for what remains of this year that's on the same scale as this?
What have they got? Not telling you that the buzz for this fight is akin to what it used to be. I'm just telling you that it's still bigger than everything else that's out there for what remains of this year.
The only real way to gauge a fight's buzz is with receipts, what it does at the box office and what it does at the gate. And
if what it does at the box office and what it does at the gate is still better than what everybody else did at the box office and at the gate, that tells a story.
It's a numbers game after all.
Maybe it don't do 1.2 or 1.1 like the first two fights did, but it might still do better numbers than everything else on pay-per-view in this country.
Yeah, in terms of boxing.
That's what I've been saying all along.
What compares to this?